So it's the year of the destroyer, and this is the second video. And I'm looking at the Kaisermarine and why they stick with Torpedoboote so long instead of going for Zerstorer, destroyer. Well, the answer is going to be an interesting one, because whilst I would wish it was a sensible, simple answer of it's this one reason, it's actually a combination of reasons, and we're going to build up to it by working our way through the coastal ships, the divisional ships, and up to the larger ships which they were building prior to World War One. And one reason is why they stick as small as they do for as long as they do. And one reason is also why the largest ships they actually find themselves in possession of in terms of destroyers, prior to in beginning of World War One, were not actually ordered by the Kaisermarine. Or rather, their components weren't ordered by the Kaisermarine. The components were ordered by another navy entirely. It's an interesting bit of history. Before we get into it, I have to talk about these books, okay? Over this year, when I'm talking about the German Navy, especially in this earlier period, the Kaisermarine and the ships of Germany, I'll be referring to usually Erich Groner's work. Now, I have my notes on his destroyers, so I haven't had to get them out of the boxes, but I will get them out of the boxes as the year goes on, because I should probably show off the actual books. And they're very useful books, they're very interesting books. They are definitely worth a read. I would say buying them as a set seems to be very, very expensive. Buying them individually seems to be cheaper, but you might not get ones of similar quality. But these are pretty much the only major work you will find that goes through in Freeman level detail of German ships of this period. Now, that's not to say others aren't starting on this. People like Aidan Dobson and Dirk Notelman are doing some extra work. There's the Kaiser's Cruisers, 1871 to 1918, and there are other works coming on the destroyers. But at the moment, if you want to have a book which is about the whole of the Navy and how it goes through all their designs and the developments, Groner is basically a one-stop shop. The 2 volumes of Groner are your one-stop shop. They're not perfect, I don't agree with everything in them, but as I've said before about other historians, there are many historians who I'll recommend whose books I will go through and go, I don't agree with that, I don't agree with that. Because this is the joy of being a historian. The facts don't change. The analysis, depending on how you weight the facts, can change. And that's probably what you'll see today if you're if you're listening to this video and you're comparing it to what others have said on these topics. How I weigh the stuff in terms of the ship designs tends to outweigh what people are writing. Because my view is usually this: when I'm looking at a ship, when I'm looking at its design, that's the choices you made. Words are cheap. People can write anything down as their reason for doing something. When you look at the actual design, do the actual forensic engineering, and actually study through designs, that will reveal what they really spent their money on. And once you realise that there's always about 3 or 4 levels of gaming and game theory going on in the construction of these ships, you start to trust less and less what are the headline reasons for why they're doing things, and you start to more and more think through and go, well, the headline probably is at least partially right, there's probably some truth in it, but it's probably not the whole truth. And that's going to give me the context and nuance which explains what matters. So if we look at the early German torpedo boats, and they're always a good example, a really fun example to get into, because one of the first things that usually shocks people when I start talking about it is the amount of them that come from Britain. Because if you're looking at them, then the class of 1884, Thornycroft provide 2, Yarrow provides 1, J.S. White of Cowes provides 2 third-class boats, and then there's 6 from Vessa and 10 from Vulcan and 6 from Schakal. And Yeah, the only one I can find which is remotely similar to these boats potentially is the USS Somers, which was built in 1897. You know, a whopping 13 years later, but two similar ideas and lines. So, yeah, there you go. These earlier boats are about concept testing. They're about break away from spar torpedoes. They're about the growth of the Navy. They're about finding out what a torpedo boat and destroyer can do. At this point, it's torpedo boat, what it can do. And that's one of the reasons why they're buying them from the British as well, because yes, you can build them yourself, but the British have been building a lot more for a lot longer. It's good to try and get some ideas from them, and to try and get some ideas that you can then bring into your own construction, into your own operation, to understand what they are doing. This is one of the fun things that often comes up on this channel when I'm talking about things, is some of viewers, I think, find it very difficult to understand sometimes that people and navies do wholesale copy from each other when it suits their needs. And I try and explain it this way. If you're the first to do something, you have no one you can copy. If you're the second to do something, or if someone's already gone down that route and has already got egg on their face from making mistakes, you should probably pay attention. You go and listen to what they've done, so you don't get the same egg on your mistakes. Egg on your face, I mean. Because if you make the same mistakes, it's worse for you. So this is why, when we're talking about the great sea voyages and the great diplomatic sort of naval voyages of this era, most people are copying what the Royal Navy did. Not necessarily they're doing it because the Royal Navy did it. The Royal Navy has established it as a method of showing sea power, but it's a bit old on that. What I mean when they're copying what Royal Navy did is they're looking at how did the Royal Navy handle port visits. What was the procedures they followed? What was the approach they had, the diplomatic rules they followed? What was their order of proceedings? Why would you copy? Because otherwise you're starting completely from scratch. The Royal Navy's already gone through all the tedious diplomacy to work this stuff out. Do you want to spend hours trying to work out various diplomatic protocols with these people? No. You're a naval officer. You'd rather do anything than that. That's actually socializing with civilians. That's annoying. So, yes, you'll go, well, how did the Royal Navy approach this? Let's do it that way ourselves. And sometimes it's going to be the first time it's you going to be someplace. And again, you might well go, well, okay, now we have to establish them. And then we have to look for a readily used methodology. Well, here you go. Here's an established methodology of how to act, of how to carry out these things. And it's the same when you're talking about technology. With the Germans here, they're looking at the Royal Navy and they're looking at the British designs and going, what's good about the British designs? What do we not like about the British designs? And 1884 is a pretty good year for it. And one of the interesting things is they continue on buying British-built vessels for quite a while. They really do. Because they're useful. Now these are the boats that are built between 1885 and 1892. We've got T16 as an example. This you can find in the Kiel Maritime Museum. It's a great little model to go and look at. And then we've also got S42, which is an S7 class boat, and S82, which is an S66 class torpedo boat. And what you start finding is the Germans are very much using numbers for their vessels. They're very much boats, so hence they're getting numbers, not ships. And they're also not even really giving them proper classes and classifications, I'd say. It's a very German system, of very mathematically inclined, and it's about, I would say, efficiency of naming rather than necessarily emotional naming. But they're a growing navy, and one of the things they are seeking with these vessels to do is they're seeking to find the small, cheap ships which can provide their force with the enabler it needs to do other things. You see, the Franco-Prussian War had left the legacy of needing a navy. What that navy was to do was open for debate. And if you're building larger assets, you want to be able to use them to go off and do things with them. But you can't do that if they've got to stay there to protect Germany, to protect your ports. And this is what the first Kaiserlich Marine's approaches to torpedo boats are all about. This is all about protecting themselves. Realistically, these vessels are not yet about fleet work. They're about coastal protection, about port protection. They will assist other things, and many of these boats will still be in service in World War One. They'll be used as minesweepers, school boats, tenders, all sorts of interesting things, and they will be lost doing those roles. But they will still be in service in World War One, just not realistically on the front line. But yes, they are extra assets, and when you start hearing about the Royal Navy, you think about its Baltic strategy, and it's trying to get in the Baltic. Yes, these old boats are part of that strategy because, okay, they're old, but they still pack 3 torpedoes. And there's the mathematics of torpedoes. The more that's being launched, the more there's likelihood of them being hit. And, you know, that's all going to cost in time to even just to put them down. So these are still a factor. They're not a very strong factor, let's be honest. Their higher speed for most of them was about 20 knots. Theoretically, some of them could do 22, 25 knots, and even 26 knots when new, but that was when new, and these are using very much triple expansion engines, using very much expansion engine systems. They are not turbines. It's a long way from getting turbines for torpedo boats at this point for Germany. And then we have the coastal torpedo boats, the coastal boats. Now these are getting a bit bigger, and these ones are particularly built from 1914 onwards. And mostly, I have to say, I'm ending the discussion of the individual classes with the V1s, not the V25s, because this video is very much about the Kaiserlich Marine and how it's approaching torpedo boats prior to World War One. And I would say the V25s are a realization that we've gone down the wrong route. And they're more to do with the World War One approach to torpedo boats than the pre-World War One approach to torpedo boats. And the Zerstorer. So I've sort of moved them to the next video. Just putting that out there now. Before we even get anywhere near there, I'm putting that out there now. Now, these are some of the larger vessels, and some people do actually call them coastal light destroyers. I'm sorry, no. Even by World War One standards, they are 100 tons, 110 tons in there lucky. They are not. They are not. They are very useful. They're not Zerstorer, not the coastal Zerstorer. They are Torpedoboote. And in fact, the Germans call them Küstentorpedoboote. Küstentorpedoboote. Because they are coastal torpedo boats. How some people decided to make this into a destroyer, I'm not sure. They are coal-fired, triple expansion steam engined. They are capable of doing 20 knots. They've got a maximum range of 900 nautical miles at 12.5 knots. They had a complement of less than 30. They carried a single 2-inch deck gun. Might be a 50mm or 52mm, depending on which type of gun it is. They carried 2 450mm, that's 17.7-inch torpedoes, and some mines. They are torpedo boats. They are torpedo boats. That is what they are. They are proud of that. They are very capable vessels, and they go on and serve in the Polish Navy, the Belgian Navy, the Estonian Navy, and the Soviet Navy. Some of them served till 1950, and I'm still not quite sure how. 92 are completed out of 113, and 30 are lost during World War One, mostly. They are good little ships. They are definitely the production line end of these vessels and these vessels. This is Germany's first forays into torpedoboote. The thing is, though, they've established now a precedent of them being cheap assets, which are force multipliers. And this has been established in the mind of the politicians. And once you've got something established in the mind of politicians, you keep it there. You keep it there for a long, long time, don't you? Well, the thing is, the Germans have started looking at other things as well, and it starts off with the Divisional Torpedoboot. Divisional torpedoboats. Now, whilst these certainly were forerunners of the large torpedo boats which come after them, or the Hochsee-Torpedoboots, they are not them. And that's an important thing to remember. These are what I would call the proving grounds of the idea behind the Hochsee-Torpedoboot. And also one reason why the Kaiserliche Marine keeps with the name Torpedoboot. Because if they keep with that, rather than moving on to Zerstorer, where everyone else at this time, at least a large amount of their contemporaneous colleagues, are moving in that direction. They're moving in the direction of the Zerstorer. The Divisional torpedo boats are launched between 1886 and 1898, and as I've talked about before, the British Daring, Havoc and Ferret classes are all laid down in roughly 1892, 1893. And so they are very much part of the scene as these ships are being ordered. These ships are also, I would argue, the Germans heading in that direction. Still, they're not massive. They are not massive, and they are not overwhelmingly powerful. I don't want anyone to start sort of thinking that scenario is the case. They are capable vessels, though. They really are, for their time. I could only find one picture of a German boat. This one. D7. The rest of the pictures here are all pictures of Thornycroft 30 knotters, which were built for the Royal Navy. And the thing is, a lot of the descriptions are comparing it to them, and one of them, D10, actually is built by Thornycroft as a 30 knotter, but she's given a German armament. And that armament is 3 50mm guns, I think L40s from memory, and 3 450mm, that's 17.7-inch torpedoes. She carries 3 tubes and a torpedo for each tube. She doesn't carry any reloads. No reloads. Crew 47 to 52. Again, compound, that's expansion steam engines. And this makes sense for this time. This is an efficient vessel. It has got a top speed of 27.2 knots. That's useful. That is a capable speed. But it comes in at full loaded about 370 tons. And none of these are ships which, frankly, you want to be going far out to sea with. And the trouble is, you start operating these divisional boats, and that's what they do. They start operating these divisional boats with a fleet. And I start looking at them and going, oh, we'd like these with us. And the thing is, torpedo boats don't have to be big because people are coming to them. That's the theory. But Zerstorer, destroyer, they have to be bigger, also, than Torpedoboot. Why? Because they have to go with a fleet to go to where those torpedo boats are. So this is why you start to see the size differential and the size growth. First of all, you've got the fleet torpedo boats. And there was 2 ideas for how to do this. The Germans had experimented with the third-class methodology. That's having small boats they could tuck aboard their larger ships and literally carry them with them as parasites. They didn't like that. No one really did. It sounded nice in theory, and I do sometimes wonder if the small uncrewed surface vessels that we keep talking about are going to turn out to be like this. It sounds so nice in theory. On paper, we have something we launch, and it's there at sea, and it's therefore it's viable, and we can recover it when we want to. And then in practice, after they've played around with it in exercises, and everyone's looked and gone, it ends up not being practical, and you end up going with something which can actually keep itself at sea. It'll be interesting to see how that one particularly develops, because the difference is you don't have the ability to do maintenance unless you've got crew aboard a vessel. We haven't yet designed a ship to be self-maintaining. Could get there, but haven't yet got there. Or if we're putting in enough redundancy that it doesn't need to be self-maintaining, that's going to make it grow in size anyway. If it's got 5 ways of doing anything, and therefore if it loses 2 it's still got plenty to function, that's not going to be a small ship. And it's similar with the torpedo boats. They're growing because, well, when you expect them to go out with you, you expect them to stay with you, and you don't want to end up towing them back, and you don't want to end up with losing them in the waves, and so they start growing bigger. And so the sea trials, and a lot of the difference starts to, in terms of what their value is versus other ships, starts to be shown. One of the other interesting things that happens is that the Kaiserlich Marines start comparing themselves more and more to the Royal Navy and what they're doing and how they're working out, and started thinking more about what suits them. I would often argue that, thanks to Tirpitz, the Kaiserlich Marine ends up trapping itself in almost building a Royal Navy in miniature, and building things which don't necessarily suit it just because the Royal Navy has them. The good thing about Torpedoboote and these vessels is that they are low enough down the food chain that a lot of the very big egos don't care about them. They don't get involved. It's not the status asset. And so whilst they support their introduction, a lot of them are very obsessed with building them. They're not caring if they're exactly the same as the Royal Navy. In fact, in some ways, it serves their interest, because in this period when these are coming into service is the first period where you start to have the issues that will eventually kill the Anglo-German naval race. I.e., the budget for the Kaiserlich Marine starts to interfere with the budget of the army. The Heer does not like its budget being interfered with. The Heer is the primary force for Germany. And it's always interesting to me that the real thing which limits the German involvement in the naval race and limits what they can do and shapes what they can do is in many ways the politics with the army, domestically, and the fights over budget, as much as it is over actual industrial capacity. Because if they'd been able to use more of the budget, they could have improved the industrial capacity, and could have therefore built more. And they had those people who were smart enough to do the research and development, they just couldn't give them money to do so, because the money was being used to pay those people to work on stuff for the army instead. But that's a little bit away. But it's also another reason why you keep with Torpedoboote, because Torpedoboote, I remember, are the cheap ships. And at a certain point, there is a perception in German politics that by building Torpedoboote, they are getting a bargain compared to British destroyer. Because the British are building destroyers which are bigger and larger to beat their Torpedoboote, and that's costing the British more, whereas they're building the cheap unit. When you look at them though, you go, yeah, there's a difference. Yes, the British ships are on average, in their generations, usually bigger, but that's because the British are building them as global assets to go with the Royal Navy wherever it needs to operate around the world. The Germans are just worried about operating in the North Sea. There is a difference in how you're constructing vessels. That explains the size differential. It's what you need them for. But anyway, shameless book plug, because after this we start to get on to the grosse Torpedoboot, the large Torpedoboot. Shameless book plug, the part where I say thank you for liking, sharing, subscribing, helping the channel grow, for being such a kind community, and we are now at 18,500 subscribers, so that's a lot of people. That's more than was standing up in a Norwegian division in at the beginning of World War II. But with that put to one side, Norwegian divisions, by the way, beginning World War II, were about 11,250 strong. There were supposed to be 3 regiments of 3,750 men. Guess what tomorrow's topic is about? When this video comes out, the next video is going to be Norway. And I prepped the 2 video. I was supposed to be recording the Norway video now, but I'm re-recording this video because the first version had of a multi-tool the whole time from the building work going on in all the way through. So apologies, that's why this is coming out on Friday rather than Tuesday. But also, what I want to add in this discussion and point out here, because I sometimes use the Shameless book plug for explaining a bit of stuff about why I'm doing certain things I am in the videos, is that this topic is going to be a bit more thematic than the previous ones have been. Which is why I'm not being so hard with the fact that technically the V-25 class should have their own slide in this video. Because technically, they are prior to World War One. But they fit more with the Kriegsmarine of World War One and its approach to Torpedoboot and the Zerstorer than they do with its pre-World War One approach. Because in many ways, they are the beginning of the World War One approach. And because of that, if I talk about them, I then have to start talking about many events inside World War One and what they got involved in and how that reflected, and of course, including up to and including the Battle of Jutland. And that makes for a very different discussion than I want to have now. This is more about the Anglo-German naval race. This is about why the Kriegsmarine positions itself as it does with its light forces in the Anglo-German naval race, and how that has an impact on their force development. And in many ways, the moment they lose the race, and they lose the race, as I've already hinted at, because and I've talked about in other videos, the Queenless of Class video on my channel is a good example of where I discuss this in extent, is that I'm talking about the Queenless of Battleship, not the aircraft carrier. I've done videos on both. It's the battleships, just clarifying that before anyone starts going looking at the aircraft carrier and goes, this doesn't have it at all. I don't think anyone would, but just in case. I still have those people who comment on alternate histories, even though I tell them they're all alternate histories, going, I don't like alternate histories. So, you know. The whole point, at the end of the naval race comes when the cost of the battleships and cost of trying to keep up the British has reached the point at which the British have managed to drive the cost so sufficiently high that it's causing an internal conflict in Germany politically with the army. And it had been getting worse and worse from about 1905, and by about 1913 the army basically goes nope. Pretty much the point is made to the Kaiser and the government. It's either the Navy loses funding, or there will be a change of government. Or, how should I put it this way? The Navy no longer gets to increase its budget anymore at the expense of the Army, or there will be a change of government. It's very politely said, but it's very much the tone going through, because the Army needs the money. The Army has to come first. Germany's borders demand that the Army comes first. So, that's the reality of it for them. And this is also one of the reasons which sort of, again, to my mind, make the V-25s fit in the later discussions, because they are, after that, okay, alright, so we need to start thinking not like miniature Royal Navy, or we have to think of ways around the Royal Navy. We have to actually start thinking not risk fleet strategy, but something else which can actually give us an edge. Which leads to the even bigger Torpedoboot. But anyway, back to the first ocean-going torpedo boats. Okay, welcome to the first of the große Torpedoboote, the large torpedo boats. And this is large. It is the whopping 544-ton, fully loaded S-90. It's large, I tell you, large. Now, someone is probably going to go, well, what about the comparisons? Well, you'll be glad to know they're actually bigger than most of their Royal Navy contemporaries being built at this point. It's a rather interesting point in history in that at this time the Royal Navy ones are roughly 350 tons. They are smaller. But the Royal Navy is going through its speed demon phase. So they're smaller, but if you consider the Viper class, which is contemporary of them, they are being built with Parsons turbines, and they are 36.5 knots of speed, armed with a single 12-pounder gun, 5 6-pounder guns, and 2 torpedo tubes. They have a crew of 68, crammed into 350 tons. 350 tons. 400 tons when fully loaded. The S-90s, in contrast, look positively statesmanlike. They are capable of 28 knots. They have a crew of 69. And their firepower evolves over time, but, they are good-sized ships. Good-sized boats. Really. That's certainly how they're treated. And they are an important part of the force structure. There are 48 of these vessels built. 48. And they will serve, believe it or not, for a very, very long time. They're still being serviced in 1921 with the Germans and others. Some of them would also get fitted with Parsons steam turbines. We'll talk about those in a second. But it starts off with they're armed with their 3 450mm, that's 17.7 inch torpedo tubes, and 3 50mm, that's 2 inch roughly L40s, which means their length of their barrel is 40 times 50. By the time we get to 1905, you have 2 other classes being produced. They're the S-90 subclasses, the SG-132, the G-132s, and the G-135s. And realistically, this feels like they're testing out ideas for the S-138, the next succeeding class. And pretty much what they do with them is they are going, right, we're going to try out some with 4 52mm, again 2 inch, 55s. So they are 52mm times 55 for their length of their barrel. And they're still carrying 3 450mm, 17.7 inch torpedo tubes. And it's the same with the 135s. They're carrying the same torpedoes again. But, okay, they now have a single 88mm, 3.5 inch, but it's an 88 L/35. And 2 of the 52mm guns. Okay. Things might be a bit of an issue. And so you've got this interesting dichotomy going on where the German boats are torpedo boat, the British are torpedo boat destroyers. The Germans are bigger, but in many ways they're carrying less weaponry. And why is this going on? Because honestly, the Germans are being built around providing stable platforms for their torpedoes. The Germans are thinking about their torpedoes as an offensive weapon. They're thinking about these boats as an offensive weapon. They're thinking about them as offensive arm, as a skirmishing offensive arm that's going to allow them to pin down the battle and shape the nature of warfare at sea. I would argue, in many ways, they are perceiving these vessels rather like the army, so at this point, perceived light cavalry. They weren't able to directly charge any positions or fight through artillery, but they were able to shape what was going on by shaping the information picture and shaping the area of the battle. And that's what the Kaiserlich Marine is going for. This is why they earn the title Große Torpedoboote. Realistically, they do. They are large torpedo boats. The transition to Zerstorer is what we'll see as time goes on. But again, the Germans keep fighting that. They really do. And now we have the Hochsee-Torpedoboot round 2, because you have to remember, at the time, they are not called Große Torpedoboote. They're called Hochsee-Torpedoboot, as in oceanic. I know we like to call Hochsee the high seas fleet, but it's actually oceanic fleet. Hochsee-Torpedoboot. And oceanic torpedo boats, ocean-going torpedo boats. Specifically, the North Sea, but we'll leave that to one side. Round 2 are the S138 class. And I couldn't find a picture of S138, but I could find a picture of S139. And I have to admit, when I compare the two, I'd rather not go to sea on either of them, let alone the North Sea, but if I've got to pick one, I'm going to go with that one. It looks like it might actually acknowledge freeboard exists. This one, I'm still not sure if it does. Middling ended up going for quite the round down turtle back, but we'll leave that to one side. These are a whole other new kettle of fish, coming in at 824 tons fully loaded when they're getting to the last variants of them. Initially, they start off at 684 tons fully loaded, and that's still a jump from the 544 tons fully loaded. It starts off at a 140 ton jump, and it grows up to a fair whack more. Now, this is also conversely the period where the Royal Navy starts to overtake and then slightly pull away with the size of the ships that they're building. Why? Because in part the Royal Navy is responding to the increase in size of their German adversaries, but also they're also looking at the North Sea and their operations. And I'd say finally there is the fact that as the German torpedo button get bigger, the Royal Navy's looking at it from the destroyer perspective is going, we need to put these things down. They are still going to be as vulnerable as they are. They're still going to have the glass jaws they always have, but with their greater size comes greater subdivision and the potential from them having great ability to withstand hits. So we need to pack a bigger punch. And you can see that because these vessels, they're ordered in 1906. Okay, that's when the S138s are ordered. It's 1906. That's the first 3 are launched. And at the same point, you're looking at the Royal Navy. They've already had the River-class destroyers in service, and they're roughly 640 tons fully loaded, and they've been in service. Well, they were first launched in 1903, so they've been in service for a few years by this point. The contemporaneous vessels, the contemporaneous classes, are the tribal class. The first, the tribals, which are laid down and launched at roughly the same time as the first of the S138s, and they are a whopping 982 tons deep loaded. This is the point at which the Royal Navy has started to push away. Yes, the Germans have jumped up, but the Royal Navy has jumped up further. And again, the reasoning is very simple. The Royal Navy is thinking about going around the world. The Germans are thinking about fighting in the North Sea. There's also the strong perception, as I keep saying, that torpedoboot are cheap. They are the force multiplier that is cheap. The torpedoes are cheap. There is partially the Je ne Cole, still legacy of that, hanging around from France and around the whole continent, but there's also the fact that the Kaiserlich Marine has this battle at home. Moving on to Zerstorer, moving on to the bigger vessels, will get them into trouble. It's bad enough they're competing with the capital ships. That's a costly. But as long as the other ones are, the other vessels they're building are considered the cheap ones, they can get them through. This is another reason why you have cruiser construction being cut short as much as it is. And this is approaching the point at which that's going to start happening for the Germans. The cruiser construction is going to go, which is why when we look at the Battle of Jutland, the really massive difference in the force structures is there are more destroyers for the Royal Navy at Jutland than the Germans had Torpedoboot, but there's also a whole lot more cruisers for the Royal Navy there than there is the German force. And that's, I would always say, whilst yes, they have a superiority in numbers in pretty much every category, there is an overwhelming majority of cruisers which really does stiffen and support their destroyers, which means that the German torpedo boats are facing a problem of not just being outmassed by their destroyer counterparts from the Royal Navy, but they're being outmassed, outnumbered by them, and outsupported by the cruisers assisting them. They're in a nightmare situation from the get-go in that battle, so we'll talk about that when we get to the World War I part of the video. Now, in this class's case, they grow. They grow in size, they grow in scale. They're also the class which introduces turbines. This class grows from having 4 coal-fired water tube boilers to having 3 coal-fired and an oil-fired water tube boiler. They go from 2-shaft vertical triple expansion to 2-shaft steam turbines to 3-shaft steam turbines. This is a class which is features a massive amount of transition, and frankly, calling them a single class is probably a complete and utter fabrication on the part of the Kaiserliche Marine. I would honestly not like to do a evolution with the first batch of ships and the last batch of ships operating together, because I don't think they could match in their operational capabilities. Because the speed ranges, again, 30 to 32 knots in top speed. But again, that's iffy because there's the trials and the fact that the turbine ones do a lot better on the trials than some of the vertical triple expansions in terms of maintaining their speed, which is going to affect how you evolute. Their crew size changes from 80 to 84. Their guns, their torpedoes, all these things change. By the end of this class, they are carrying 4 500mm, that's 20-inch torpedoes. They start off with 3 450mm, that's 17.7-inch torpedoes. By the end, they're carrying usually an 88 and 2 52s. But at the beginning, they start off with an 88 and a 350s. And then they, for some reason, decide to go to 288s. It's again one of these interesting points when people start to bring up and go, this class is this. And I have heard some beautiful presentations, and I have gone, but that class is not homogeneous. This class is not homogeneous. This class is a class of evolution. Evolution of thinking, evolution of technology, evolution of development, evolution of everything, going through one of the busiest, most horrendous ship development periods of history. We are talking about a class which was under construction and various batches from 1906 to 1911. 5 years. Think about what comes out and it starts to dominate. The dreadnoughts, the battle cruisers, all the other achievements in terms of long-range gunnery and the growth in gun sizes. Think about it. They start off, they're talking about 11 and 12 inches as your capital ship primary armament. By the end, by 1911, you're starting to hear the rumours of 15 inches. And 16 inches, and discussions of much bigger guns. There's a tremendous evolution going on here. There is no surprise that this batch is so different. This class is so different across its different matches. But then that begs the question, why are they all called S-138s? Why are they grouped together as such? Why? And again, it's sort of like we're dealing with the Arleigh Burkes. The Arleigh Burkes are a known quantity. There is a quantum difference in the technology between Flight 1 and Flight 3. The design and architecture, sadly, hasn't been allowed to evolve similarly. They have to look like a Burke. And that's one of the reasons why the class really needs a replacement. It's because you need to have design and architecture which supports the infrastructure which is now required by the systems aboard as efficiently as it could do. Whereas what they've got is an evolution on an evolution on an evolution on an evolution on a basis which was not designed to support those things originally. In this case, though, because no one pays any attention, they're not even paying lip service to it. They really aren't. You start to look at some of the later vessels, the later designs, and you could be excused for thinking they were a completely different class. You really would be. And now, through the magic of YouTube, here is one of the later ones. This is 182. She's apparently part of the same class. Please note, she has a second stack. The masts have been rearranged. The hull's been rearranged. But they are apparently, according to the information, part of the same class. The same group of torpedo boats. Now, you can say they are playing fast and loose, and I'm sure people will have various reasonings for this, but let's be honest. They are literally keeping the grouping going, and they are using the same designation to keep it going because it makes it easier for the funding arguments, not because it is the same class. The batches are, to an extent, treated by some of the Navy as completely different completely different classes. It is grouped together, and I would argue this strongly. It is grouped together largely by historians who are continuing on the documentary myth, and the documents say they are one group, and the Kaiserlich Marines bodies which are trying to appeal for funding, who are saying they're the same vessels, because if they just say, oh, we need to order more of these, then hopefully no one looks too closely at what we're getting. No one looks too closely at it. But those are very different ships. Those are really different ships. And they represent the evolution in thinking time. Again, moving on from 17.7 inch to 20 inch torpedoes, they do a brief stop at 18 inch. There is a brief stop at the 460mm torpedo tubes. But you've gone from 3 17.7 inch to 4 20 inch. That's a big jump in capability. That's a big jump in stopping power. And yes, that does reflect the vessels you're aiming to stop and their size and their increase, but still, that's a really hefty jump. But, and the ultimate problem of this, is that you can only keep up this growth for so long before you start to attract attention. And this is what leads to the V1 class, where they return to 570 tons. Now these vessels, nicknamed the Cripples by some in service of the Kaiserlich Marine, were forced through by Vice Admiral von Lans. Now, Wilhelm von Lans is an honourable gentleman, and he was supposed to be making cheap boats that were going to provide the mass. That's what he believed. He actually believed the propaganda. It's always trouble when you get someone who believes your own propaganda, whether it's internal propaganda for funding or it's actual public propaganda, actually in a position of power. They tend to believe it, and this is a problem. these vessels, not really the most capable vessels they could have got. They had hoped to get something which was still going to be seaworthy and capable, and I should say the other description of them is Lans cripples, for the Admiral who pushed them through. 570 tons. 70.2 meters in length, carrying two 88mm guns. Not exactly big ones either, but 88mm. And four of those 20-inch, those 500mm torpedo tubes. The thing is, in 1911, their contemporaneous counterparts from the Royal Navy might be carrying less torpedoes. They might be. They might not be. Depends on which class you're talking about. The Fories, which are a bit after them, carry two twin 21-inch, that's 533mm torpedo tubes, three 4-inch guns, that's 102mm, and usually some pom-poms, often 2-pounder pom-poms, and often a few of them, for various systems, various policies. There's also, sitting there in the Royal Navy, the 1,800-ton HMS Swift from 1907, which is basically, it was armed with a lot of 4-inch guns. And at one stage, it would even end up with a 6-inch gun on it, just to see if they could. But I suppose mainly its contemporaneous are the Acasta, the Acheron, and the Acon classes. And they're, at the low end, 780 tons. At the high end, and then at about 1,000 tons. Fully loaded. Most carrying a couple of torpedoes. 21-inch torpedoes. But 4-inch guns and 12-pounders. So 76mm 3-inch guns and 100mm guns. These don't match in well. These are not matching in. These look like you've built a coastal class. And if you consider the coastal class, the Type A's, which are later on built, that does fit. These are very much smaller vessels. They're good looking. I mean, they're a striking looking ship. I will not say they're not. They have a bit of a je ne sais quoi about them, in terms of their style. But in terms of their seakeeping abilities and their stability as a torpedo platform, let alone a gun platform, they leave a lot to be desired. I would also argue that selling two of these to Greece to counter the larger S-138s, which were sold to the Ottoman Empire, is kind of cruel and unusual punishment. Because whilst these are more modern assets, I would prefer to be on the 38s. Or rather, the batch of 38s they were. Let's be honest, they're not original flavour S-138s. But I suppose this is more of an honest approach. This is more of an honest of, this is a torpedo button. It is. The V1 class are a torpedo button. I do not consider them Gauss torpedo button. I'm not even sure they should be included in the Hochsee-Torpedoboot. They are, technically, but also in many ways they are a regression. They are the Kaiserlich Marine trying to still wrestle with the idea that it needs to have small boats. And I would argue that the V1 class and Admiral Lans realistically are reacting to a lot of the discussion that's been going on around their torpedo boats, about them being these small, vital vipers which are going to offset numerical advantages and give them the fighting edge, the close edge, which is cheap and to an extent expendable, although you prefer not to lose anyone. But you know, they're very small crews, and if you lose them, that's what happens. With that being said, though, the V1 class did have a crew of 74. So they weren't that much smaller than the much larger later variants of the S-138s. And to me, that also opens up another problem. Because if we're going to consider these destroyers, and I don't, I very much put them in the torpedo button category of the German force. I don't agree with the immediate interchangeability of the large torpedo boats with destroyers. There is a difference in construction in terms of the subdivision within them. There is a difference in what you're building the vessel around. If you're building a torpedo boat and you're building it massively around its torpedoes and high speed. If you're building a destroyer, to an extent you're building it to fight another vessel. It's kind of like the difference between battle cruiser 2-word and battle cruiser 1-word. Okay? Both are glass cannons. They have incredibly powerful weapons, which they're not designed really to take. They'll take a beating by. But one of them is designed to survive glancing blows and carry on bashing away. The other one, a glancing blow will tip it over. And this is, again, one of the interesting things you're dealing with, is that we're going to deal with a war, in case of World War I, where you'll get boats which are called destroyers, but they're destroyers from the 1890s, fighting torpedo boats which are from the mid-1900s, so 1906, 1907, they're completely outclassed. And then, well, people will then go, well, they're obviously, those torpedo boats were destroyers. And it's the case, it's the pace of technology has moved on, that the thing which was the be-all and end-all killer of torpedo boats in the 1890s is no longer that. And the thing that was built to fight has outgrown it by that point. I'm not sure if that necessarily applies to the V1. See, they do have an 88mm gun, so... But it's they don't even get the good 88. They get the 88L30, which had been designed back in 1892. It was not the good one. There are good ones. That was not the good one. There are better ones that they could have given it. I feel sad for them to an extent. This class suffers because they have an ideologue for an admiral. They really do. They have someone who believes in their own honour and what they've been, putting forward has their case as the argument for, these ships, more than actually looking at them and going, what do they really need to be? There again, we're also talking about a man who later on has his senior staff officer, while he's in charge of 1st Squadron of the High Seas Fleet, produce a paper which criticises the naval armament of pre-World War One, their strategy, and the North Sea being seen as a primary theatre instead of it being recognised that the Baltic's their primary theatre, as it's the critical supply route for Swedish iron ore. Yeah. For some reason, he found himself removed from post in 1915 and placed on the reserve list. One of the interesting things about history is what happens if he doesn't get kicked out. Lans is a interesting gentleman. I wouldn't necessarily want to put him in charge of any fleet, because he's kind of very focused on what he thinks is right, and not tend to be that strategically flexible, which is bad for a fleet commander who has to balance a lot of issues and a lot of politics as in terms of the strategy and the international relations. But it would have been interesting. It would have been interesting. As Inspector of Torpedoes, he'd certainly, from 1909 to 1912, he'd certainly exerted a lot of influence. And I'd also say, if you get a chance to read the paper produced by that staff officer, I think his name was... Sorry, I remember it by the fact he's got a similar part of his name to my old poodle, my previous poodle. So, Wolfgang Wegener. I think it's Wolfgang Wegener, because the previous poodle was called Mozart. Mozart Wolfgang. Yeah, it fit, okay, let's be honest. He's a poodle. It was a poodle. A black poodle. A gorgeous one. But I think it was Wolfgang Wegener. Let me check it up. Yes, it was. I should have put that in my notes, so I would have been had it straight to the answer and been really confident with it. But I hadn't wondered if I was going to go that deep into the reads of discussing this particular section of them of the vessels. But I've recorded this a couple of times and I haven't gone into it, and I think I should have gone into it and should have given you a bit of the background. So I apologise for this bit seeming a bit ad hoc added in. But every time I watched it through, I wanted to learn that and know that information, so I thought I'd try a bit adding it in. And I've left it as this, so maybe you find it interesting, maybe you don't. But then we get on to the coming of the truly large torpedoboot, the Zerstorer, the truly large ones, after the V1s and their issues. So whilst the latter S-138s had certainly flirted and certainly were the gross Torpedoboot and were certainly pushing away, and whilst the early S-90s had certainly been larger than even the destroyers of the Royal Navy, I'd say it's really this period where the Hochsee-Torpedoboot become the gross Torpedoboot. After the V1s, after the disastrous experience of, let's try a tiny ship and try and cram all our ideas and desires into this tiny vessel. After that's fallen flat, things start to change. You start to get certain assets being procured. Now, some of them are things like the G101s for the Argentine Navy, which were 1,800 tons fully loaded. Nearly 1,850 tons. And then there's the B-97s, which are nearly 1,750 tons fully loaded. And they were courtesy of machinery which had been ordered by the Imperial Russian Navy for their next generation destroyers, but which, of course, with war breaking out, they weren't getting. And so they weren't getting their destroyers, and so the various yards turned around to the Kaiserlich Marine and went, so you want some big destroyers? Yeah, do you? Well, we have some machinery for you. How do you like it? How do you like it? And the Kaiserlich Marine went, very much, very, very much, because we've just had an idiot in charge of our torpedoes, and we need big boats. We need big boats now. These in the V-25s are realistically coming in are the big boats, which are going to provide them with the large torpedo boats, the gross Torpedoboot, and eventually the Zerstörers that they need. And they do need them. Because, you see, if the battle is going to be an ambush, and that's what a lot of the strategy had been around. It's kind of like the Japanese plan for World War II. In realistic terms, it is really like the Japanese plan for World War II, because the idea for the Germans to get an even footing with the Royal Navy is that they managed to get a section of the Royal Navy split off, of the Grand Fleet split off on its own. They can surround it with the High Seas Fleet and they can massacre it, which means they need their torpedo button to go in and do it, because they're in many ways the bits which are able to be sacrificed and rebuilt, and thus theoretically rebuilt more quickly. So the idea is use them to deliver the kill, because if you try and deliver the kill battleship on battleship, it'll be a mauling fight. It'll take ages, which gives time for the rest of the Grand Fleet to show up, and also is going to cost you battleships. So the whole point is it's supposed to be the torpedo boats. It's supposed to be the torpedo bomb. It's supposed to be these vessels getting in and getting the kill. Kind of like the Japanese strategy of attrition on any fleet approaching them, and then a decisive battle after they've attrited the fleet. The attrition phase is the more important part of the strategy in many ways, because it's supposed to whittle down the enemy forces to a point at which they are near parity or maybe even inferior in strength to the IJN. So they can deliver a decisive victory, which then allows them to dictate peace. The German strategy: get a section of the Royal Navy's Grand Fleet on its own, destroy it, achieve parity, then use that to either negotiate from a position of strength for peace, or to get a battle where you can again achieve a victory. Never doubt that you will achieve the victory. And always remember, your opponent is going to play ball and let themselves be split up enough that you can do it to them. That's the point. And the trouble is, realistically, the first discussion of battles are all focused on the torpedoes, because the torpedoes are what are going to give you a decisive kill quickly. They're going to make that hole in the ship, which is going to make it sink. Again, I say this on my videos many often, but I will keep saying this until people remember it. Everyone remembers it. Worldwide, there are two ways to sinking a ship. 1, you start a fire that can't be put out by the crew. 2, you start and make a hole which is letting water in, which cannot be blocked by the crew. Letting air into ships doesn't sink them. Fire and water being let in sink them. Air doesn't. And so, this is the point. The torpedoes would sink them. But the moment you start thinking, well, hang on, what happens if we don't get that battle? What happens if we have a brawling fight? What happens if their torpedo boats are going to... their destroyers are going to get involved? How are we going to deal with them? Well, then you start thinking, well, actually, we might need to fight them off. And that's when you get into real trouble, because then that's when the Germans are going, well, what are the British relying on to fight us off? Oh, a whole load of light cruisers as well as their destroyers. What do we have to fight them off? Well, we haven't been building light cruisers. Okay, we need to change things then. And it's the classes which come after this. This period has been a flirting with the idea of a Zerstorer. It has been growing up to the Gross Torpedoboot. But realistically, the V1s and this change in numbering, because we've gone for a completely different style of boat, and shrunk it down, has really actually clarified for the Kaiserlich Marine what they really actually want. When they're seen with what this is what we've been pretending we wanted to buy, versus what we've actually been buying as the S-138s have transferred into bigger and bigger vessels. And we don't want it. We really don't want it. That's not what we want. And the trouble is, this happens too late. This happens 1912, 1913, and as I've said before, that's when the Anglo-German naval race is over, because the Royal Navy has upped the ante to the point at which the German army has gone, no. No. You're costing too much money. You're starting to affect our budget. And this is what has the impact on World War One and on German fleet operations, because, yeah, they do start building the V-25s, and the V-25s are good. I'm going to be discussing them later on, but the thing to remember with the V-25s is they build 71 of them. 57 of them are built during World War One. 62 vessels of that class are lost during the war, during World War One. 62 out of 71. That's horrendous. It's even worse when you think that by the time of Jutland, there are literally 32 in service. The Germans take 61 torpedo boats to Jutland. 61. And you start to think, which torpedo boats are you taking with you? Which torpedo boats would you take with you? And that becomes a really interesting topic once you start to look into them, because you think, well, it's going to be the newest torpedo boats. Hang on. That includes the V1s. Do I want to take the V1s, the 24 V1s I have, to that? The 26 V1s I have to that, I mean. Do I? It's a question. It honestly is. This, by the way, this slide, I do want to apologize about it if it's terrible. I wrote this document when I was about 12. Please do note, I am dyslexic with a form of dyslexia which is called I have no short-term memory, and I'm dyslexic dysgraphic. And one of the ways I learn things is getting stuff into my long-term memory, so I tend to write them out as tables and write it out so I'll always remember it. This means I share quite a few characteristics of some autistic people. I'm not autistic. I'm a different bag of fun. No functioning short-term memory. So everything depends on working through my long-term memory in my brain. It's basically, imagine a computer which has no RAM, so it has to run on a really fast sort of hard drive setup. That's my brain. Now, why am I bringing up this table? Well, because when I was looking through it for notes for this particular presentation, and I've got them for every navy in that period, disturbingly enough, out of 155 of these larger Hochsee-Torpedoboot, ocean torpedoboot, large or Gross-Torpedoboot, the Kleines Marine got 149 because they sold them 2 to Greece, 4 to the Ottomans. 92 were turbine powered. That includes the V1s. They take 61 torpedo boats to Jutland. Now, admittedly, they do build another 18 V-25s between 1914 and Jutland that enter service in time to be actually worked up for Jutland. Technically, there's a couple which enter service in May 1916, and there's interesting discussions over them. But there again, you have to consider vessel availability. Not all of them are going to be available. Some of them are going to be maintenance. Some of them are going to need service. Some of them are going to be bashed in accidents. And you start to realise that you're probably not going to have all your V-25s that you actually have in service with you. So Jutland comes up. You're going for these operations. Which boats do you take with you? Well, historically, they did take the V1s. They did. And that puts them at, immediately, to my mind, a bit of a disadvantage. Those boats are not their their best seakeepers. They are not their most capable. They are what they have available. They are what they have available, but they're not their best. They also take the V-25s. The V-25s are mostly in 3rd Torpedo Boat Flotilla and 1st Torpedo Boat Flotilla, but they do take 5th with them. They do take 5th and they do take 7th Torpedo Boat Flotillas. And they're in the main fleet. If you start to look at the actual torpedo boats of the flotillas attached to the scouting force, that's the battle cruisers, well, that starts to make things even more different. Because there again, they're V-25s, but they're also G-101s. They're the Argentinian boats. They're not their production boats. So realistically, going through the list of vessels they are taking with them, the boats they're taking with them, they are not taking the earlier boats with them. They're not taking the earlier torpedo boat with them. They're taking the later ones. And even though they are taking the V1s, it's very much a case of you are with the Grand Fleet, or rather, you're with the High Seas Fleet to be, in many ways, in some ways, the things we sacrifice to go off to take on the Grand Fleet. You know, they're taking them with them, it seems, as part of because of, well, if we have to sacrifice anything to get our fleet away, we're okay with sacrificing the V1s. They're the ones we can afford to sacrifice. And they've left the earlier boats, the S-138s and the F-1s, behind doing other operations, supporting other work, supporting the probing on the Baltic going on, supporting the operations going on the North Sea against the Harwich Force, against the Channel Barrage and all these things. That's what they're off doing. They took the V1s with them. And honestly, that's always, to an extent, surprised me. Ever since I wrote this particular Excel spreadsheet and out and put it together, I looked at the V1s and was going, but you're the cautionary tale. You're the turning point. And then I thought about it more. And then I looked into what the writings were and what the plans were. And it came to me that those are the boats they could afford to use. They could afford to, if worst comes to worst, lose. With that being said, I hope you enjoyed today's video. I hope you found it interesting. And realistically, today's question is, well, what do you think? Do you think they're destroyers? Do you think they're torpedo bottom? And does it really matter? At this point, to my mind, the difference between torpedo bottom and the torpedo bottom, especially an oceanic or large torpedo bottom and a destroyer, is how much emphasis it puts on its gun armament. That's it. A torpedo boat is built around its torpedoes. Torpedoes are the primary. A destroyer is built in this period where the guns and the torpedoes are, I wouldn't say equal, but I'd say the torpedoes are prima inter pares, first amongst equals, not the dominant. If that makes sense. Hope you found it interesting. Hope you enjoyed it, and hope it's given you something to think about. And that being said, what we've got coming next week? Next week is building a fleet. The USN goes full 4-stacker. That's going to be fun. That's going to be fun. Thank you very much for watching, and take care.